Good morning, Liberty. It is Friday morning, March 1st, 2019, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. My name is Michael Boldin, broadcasting to you live through the 10th Amendment Center's YouTube channel here on the West Coast in downtown Los Angeles in my home office and studio. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I really appreciate every single one of you. I think it's really amazing anytime people decide that they're interested in listening to what I have to say, so I'm very grateful for that. Whether this is your first time or you've been here repeatedly, and there's a number of people like Tyler B. and EHP Training out in the live chat who I see regularly. Thank you guys. I'm very grateful for you hanging out with me today. Now, in this episode, I want to talk about some new gun control legislation passed by the Imperial House of Representatives. And I say that kind of jokingly, but kind of true. But in the House led by Nancy Pelosi, we see new background check laws that have been passed. Now, I'm not going to have a debate about background checks. So I'm starting out this episode, and we'll talk about this entire episode through this entire show about background checks under the standard that all federal gun control measures, acts, orders, rules, regulations, agencies like the ATF are unconstitutional and shouldn't exist. This isn't a debate about what the right background check is, the right amount of time, who should have a background check, what kind of exceptions, how narrow it is, none of that. So I'm only going to talk about these programs from a wider perspective, that they're all unconstitutional, but they're not brand new. And that's really the goal of this episode. So I'm going to talk about very briefly what they passed, but then kind of go back through the history a little bit, not all the way back to the National Firearms Act of 1934, but to the Gun Control Act and then the Brady Act and into the present. Because I think it's important for us to, as I put in the description a little late, but I put in the description, it's important for us to strike the root. If you support the right to keep and bear arms, and I think even if you don't, this isn't an issue that's important to you personally. I know that everyone is motivated by their own things. I think there's something to learn about the strategy in what I'm talking about here, no matter what issue you want to work on. So hopefully there's something that you can take away from that. So let's get right to it. Again, I really appreciate everyone joining me. If you are watching live or even in the archive, make sure to smash the like button, leave some comments, whether in the live chat or the archive, and of course, share the link to the video or the podcast version with your friends and family. And of course, we have all the archives and the show notes, etc., over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/Good Morning Liberty. So let's get right to it. First of all, a report from Vox. This was in the middle of the week. The House just passed what could be the biggest change to federal gun laws in decades. Now, of course, they don't think it's enough because these are gun grabbers. The research, however, as the subtitle suggests, that Congress should go even bigger. And for those of you who are watching the video, you can see this nice picture of Nancy and friends in front of H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2019. Now, some people tell you it's not really that bipartisan, but I'm going to make the case that it really is. And here's the report. I'm just going to go through this briefly. The Democrat-controlled House of Representatives on Wednesday, that would have been February 27th, February 27, 2019, in case you're listening later on, passed a universal background check bill, which, if the Senate were interested in passing it, which we know they're not, would be the most significant gun control legislation in a generation. Under current federal law, and this is just the quick overview, licensed dealers, these FFLs, are required to run a background check to make sure a buyer doesn't have a criminal record, history of mental illness, or any other factor that legally bars him or her, come on, Fox, that's not politically correct, from purchasing a gun. But the law, Vox tells us, has a big loophole. And this is, of course, the gun show loophole we've heard about for years from the gun grabbers. And this is how Vox puts it. Private sellers, meaning unlicensed. Think of how that could expand to other things. A private seller. A lemonade stand is a private seller. A garage sale is a private seller. What if we have to have unlicensed seller laws and background checks on all these? Well, just guns, of course. It'll never go further than that, just like the income tax. Well, they don't have to run a background check. Vox complains. So someone who doesn't run a licensed gun shop can sell or gift a firearm at a gun show over the internet or to friends and family without verifying through a background check that the buyer isn't legally prohibited from purchasing the weapon. And this new bill, H.R. 8, which the House passed, would close the loophole, although it would leave some exemptions open. So the exemptions are probably what, and I didn't read the whole article. This was the first one that I noticed that came up in my RSS feeds. I don't subscribe to Vox, but I think someone else was talking about it. I saw the link. I wanted to actually link. I know some people are going to complain that I linked to Vox, but I like linking to the people who are on the opposition, so we understand where they're coming from. A friend long ago who was studying for the bar, she actually reprimanded me for spending too much time reading things from people that I already agree with. What's the point? She said, of course she's thinking from an attorney. And she's like, the work that you do kind of fits that approach as well. You have to know what they're doing to be able to outmaneuver them. So I like listening to what Vox has to say and all kinds of other people, neocons and a bunch of other trash. So here's what they say. For years, the proposal for universal or comprehensive background checks, keep in mind that phrase, comprehensive background checks, has been the top item on gun control advocates' wish list. The gun grabbers tell us that comprehensive background checks is the number one thing that gun grabbers want to get done next. Remember that. In a couple of minutes, I'm going to get back to it. They do also point out that Donald Trump's administration has come out against the bill. They put out a statement, and I didn't put an additional link to this because you can click through in the Vox article. But if you look at it, they come through with this a statement of administration policy against H.R. 8 and H.R. 1112, which I'm going to cover briefly here in a moment, that the administration is against it. But remember what I said. And what Vox has to say. Vox is acting as the mouthpiece in support of this, calling it not good enough, pushing it to be further, and then also pointing out that this is the number one goal of gun grabbers. Well, if we're talking about who's to blame, and we're saying it's just Vox or just Nancy Pelosi, because a lot of the arguments I see is, oh, okay, here's Nancy, now she comes in and things get bad, as if everyone has amnesia. Or everyone is so clueless about recent modern history that they can think that Nancy Pelosi is only doing this. Now, Nancy's awful, but Nancy's doing this on her own, and she doesn't have any help from the other team. Let's start out with one piece of that puzzle, and I'm going to go to a tweet from last year from Orange Man Bad. I know a lot of people who love the president, anytime you say anything opposed to any of his policies or any of his approaches, they just make fun of you and say, oh, they're just a never Trumper or Orange Man Bad. I don't care. I'm for the Constitution, which means I believe in the right to keep and bear arms. And I also believe, as I stated right at the beginning, that the federal government does not have any authority to do any background checks. They're all unconstitutional. They don't have any authority for any of these things. Well, 1 year ago, Donald Trump says, I will be strongly pushing comprehensive background checks. Now, I know a lot of Trump supporters, Second Amendment supporters, right to keep and bear arms supporters want to believe that the NRA-backed president is the good guy on this, and I will say just come out completely that he is not. Now, Trump isn't to blame on this either. Trump is like Nancy Pelosi wants comprehensive background check. Or as Vox says, comprehensive background checks has been the top item on gun control advocates' wish list for years. And here is Donald Trump saying, I will be strongly pushing background checks. Now, people are going to say, well, the administration is opposed to it. But what do you think is going to happen if a year ago and possibly earlier, I don't know, was he advocating for this earlier? I don't know. I do know for a fact that he publicly posted that he is pushing for this. And now that Nancy Pelosi has her version of it, His administration is opposed to it. So what are we supposed to expect? If you're going to push for something that shouldn't be done in the first place, that when the opposing party gets in power, that they're going to come up with your version of it or somehow that it's okay? No, of course not. You shouldn't be advocating for this kind of garbage in the first place. And everyone who does is a part of the problem. So Nancy Pelosi, Vox, the rest of the gun grabbers who want comprehensive background checks, along with Donald Trump, have created a situation, in my opinion, and the people who turn a blind eye to this or who support it have created a situation where this is being pushed. Now, even though if it got past the Senate, it would get vetoed. It doesn't have a veto override. This is how these things build up over time. They don't necessarily file legislation because it's going to go into law. We do the same thing on a state level, too. A lot of times we support bills we know are not going to pass because it's going to take a few years to get it done. Don't think for a moment that if Mitch McConnell does not let this come to a vote in the Senate, that this is done. We know that they are pushing for it. And they're getting step by step closer to making it happen, especially if you have the supposed Second Amendment president calling for something similar under the same name, just not the right version from Nancy, of course. Now, let's go to the other bill that was passed. This was from USA Today, and it came out yesterday, February 28th. For the second day in a row, USA Today reports the Democrat-led House passed legislation toughening the background check system for gun purchases. The bill, approved on a largely party line vote of 228 to 198, would increase from 3 days to at least 10 the number of days a seller has to wait for a response from the system before transferring a firearm. And I believe that was one of the complaints in the administration's policy, that making it longer was somehow a problem. Well, and it is. And I'll get to this again, and I've done a number of shows that covered this. When you turn a blind eye, when you create a new baseline, of course, people will always use that baseline to expand on it. So opposing it for being too long of a waiting period is not the right position. Oppose the background check and the waiting period completely in every situation. Now, you may not get rid of it all at once. You can chip away at it in your strategy and implementation, your opposition implementation. But never say that it's okay, because as soon as you do, someone's going to take it to the next level. They always use the status quo as the baseline and try to build upon it. So these background checks, where do they come from? And I mentioned the NFA. I've talked about the National Firearms Act of 1934. That was really the first, unless someone can correct me, I believe that was the first major, if not any, federal gun control measure passed in 1934. The next one that I am aware of, the big one, there's I think a couple of smaller ones in between, but the big one was the Gun Control Act of 1968. So we have to remember, once you pass one, then they're going to pass another one. Once you pass another one, then they're going to expand on that. Once you expand on that, they're going to expand on that again. So the Gun Control Act of 1968 was then, after, of course, an emergency, after the attempt on President Reagan's life, we had the Brady Handgun Violence Protection Act. And here it is in Wiki. You can love Wiki or hate it, but there's some just basic information here that I think is useful for this conversation here. The Brady Act, passed in 1993, November 1993, Public Law 103-159, is an act of the U.S. Congress that mandated federal background checks on firearms purchasers in the United States and imposed a 5-day waiting period on purchases until the NICS system was implemented in 1998. So I guess at some point in there, the 5-day waiting period was reduced to 3, maybe because of the NICS system, and now they want to extend it to 10. The point, again, is you start with 1, and you're okay with it, and you don't resist it at every turn. They're going to come up with something else, and then eventually they're going to expand it. In decades, this idea of a 3-day waiting period would be seen as a blessing. in comparison to where I believe they want to go. And they, meaning the gun grabbers. The gun grabbers listed gun control advocates, if I'm being politically correct, like Vox would probably like to be. This is comprehensive background checks and strengthening in it. Top wish list. And then the NRA-backed president who says he wants comprehensive background checks. So not good. So what's the Brady Act? I believe, was the Congress that year, I think, yeah, so this was Clinton. So it was introduced by Chuck Schumer. It was a Democrat-controlled House, a Democrat-controlled Senate, Bill Clinton in office signing it. So, of course, the gun rights supporters often will say, well, the Democrats are giving us more. The Democrats. It's the Democrats that are the problem. They don't want to point out that the Republican who was endorsed by the NRA, Donald Trump, is on board for even making that thing stronger or worse, in my view. So the Brady Act was passed by Democrats, signed by a Democrat. But was it really a Democrat bill? Let's look at what the NRA has to say. And I didn't do any highlights here, but I've read this a few times. This is from Stephen Holbrook, who is one of the leading kind of legal thinkers behind the NRA approach. And I think he makes a lot of good statements, but let's take a look what they have to say. February 28th, 2018, 1 year ago, NRA's support for the National Instant Criminal Background System. That's the NICS system that came out of the Brady Act. Fact-checking the fact-checker. So what happened was the Washington Post talked about how the NRA was opposed to the Brady Act because they sided with Sheriff Mack and Sheriff Prince in opposing the commandeering of local law enforcement officers. This is one of the few times that the NRA has actually taken a pro-10th Amendment stance. They do not like the 10th, and they've opposed most of our efforts with in the states to nullify federal gun control. They don't like it. But maybe the Washington Post is right, and the NRA opposed it. Well, according to Stephen Holbrook, he said, so he talked about the background here. The NICS system, NICS, set up by the permanent provisions of the Brady Act, which frankly should have been called the NRA Act. Let me read that again because I stumbled. I apologize. The NICS system, set up by the permanent provisions of the Brady Act, which frankly should have been called the NRA Act, is run by the FBI and is constitutional because Congress has the power to tell federal employees what to do. Their only opposition to the Brady Act, according to Holbrook here, the only opposition that NRA had was that Congress is trying to get local officials to do things instead of the ATF. So not only are they arguing in favor of the ATF's existence, but they're also arguing in favor of these background checks. And they're actually saying that the Brady Act is the NRA bill. Yeah. Pretty bad. They say Congress also has the power to offer financial assistance to the states to enable them to report criminal convictions, blah, blah, blah. The state's ability to make these reports was enhanced by the NRA-supported NICS Improvement Act of 2007. But here's the kicker. The NRA opposed the original Brady bill because it was nothing but a waiting period with a mandate to the states. They weren't really on board with just a waiting period. And they didn't want to mandate the states to do something, even though they want to put mandates on the states in other areas. So they only opposed it because it was a waiting period, wasn't good enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't enough gun control, with a mandate to the states to conduct background checks only on handgun buyers. Wasn't enough. The NRA originated the idea of and supported an instant background check by the FBI on all firearm buyers. That became NICS. So the NRA, in a public statement in 2018, just days after, what was the date on Donald Trump's tweet? February 22nd, 2018, Donald Trump, the NRA-backed, Second Amendment supposedly supporting president, said he is going to be strongly pushing comprehensive background checks. 6 days later, the NRA comes out with it. NRA-ILA comes out with an official statement from Stephen Hallbrook, who says that the Brady Act was really the NRA Act. The NRA actually came up with this entire system. And again, I go back to the point, I am not going to debate the constitutionality of any federal gun control, period. It is just below me. Like, if someone says, I want to learn about it, that's one thing. I'll just point them to the Second Amendment, shall not be infringed. And if that isn't enough, and they want to talk about how it only applies to the militia or whatever it may be, they're really not on board. They want it to be something else. If they're willing to have a chat, that's one thing. But I am not debating people like this who believe that federal gun control is okay. The Second Amendment doesn't authorize it. And the delegated powers, the 10th Amendment doesn't authorize it either. If you understand that the Constitution was written under a principle that was loosely known as positive grant. Basically, if it's been delegated, if it's in there, they can do it. If it's incidental, basically a lesser power to effectuate the delegated powers, they can do it. But they got to be careful on stuff like that. And there's nothing in there that says, oh, well, we can make decisions on who can and cannot own a firearm. That is just not something the federal government is authorized to do. And so therefore, the NRA is an anti-Second Amendment organization, especially in this regards. I don't know everything that they do. And I don't see any difference other than in the specific approach of how they want background checks between the supporters of the Brady Act, between Nancy Pelosi, between Donald Trump, and the NRA and Stephen Hallbrook. It's not like... I've heard for years that the NRA supported the NFA. Oh, that must have been run by a Trojan horse at the time. They must have been supported by a Trojan horse, and things have been better since then. But this is just 1 year ago. They're not saying, oh, wow, we shouldn't have supported this because it's going to lead to someone like Nancy Pelosi taking it in another direction, expanding on it. We may not like her style. We may not like how she's expanding it. But if she would just leave well enough alone, and we can trust that those people will do that, then we'll be okay. But no, this goes against all the principles that the founders supported. It is not good. And then just wrapping that up one more time, a couple days earlier, on February 20th last year, Trump says, whether we are Republican or Democrat, we must now focus on strengthening background checks. He didn't just so he's using the phrases of the gun grabbers. Now, I don't think this is going to be some 4D chess garbage because he's literally actively pushing to make this happen. And the NRA is on board with it. And this is the biggest, supposedly, gun rights organization out there. I know there's a lot of people who support our work who are NRA supporters, NRA members. I'm not telling you not to be. I'm not telling you what to do. I mean, this is just bad news. And maybe it explains why they don't like our work here. I don't know. They've opposed us aggressively in Missouri. In fact, the original sponsor of the Second Amendment Preservation Act, the bill that would nullify all federal gun control in Missouri, which actually made it out of both houses in Missouri a few years ago, was opposed so aggressively by the NRA that the sponsor there, Senator Brian Nieves, who's a bit of a bomb thrower, burned or tore up his NRA card on the floor of the state Senate. There's new versions of that bill now in up under consideration. So before moving forward into the next step of this, I want to say hi to my friends out in the live chat. I already said hello to Tyler B and EHB Training, Alan Mosley. I guess I'm pissed. Yeah, he says neocons and all kinds of other trash. Things are getting spicy here. Yeah, tired of all the winning. Orange bump stock man bad, says Scouse Jack. Do not comply, nullify EHP training. Absolutely. And Gerard Perry points out, and of course, now our work here focuses primarily on state and local and individual action to nullify the feds. There are some areas where we work on undermining state power, constitutional carry, for example. I don't want to actually have any permission slip to have a right to defend yourself, because then it's not a right. So, but most of the work that we do deals with the feds, or at least in that perspective. But Gerard Perry points out, he says, I'm really impressed by the Washington sheriffs and even New York sheriffs not enforcing the SAFE Act. I've seen a lot of statements on that. I do want to see how that plays out if they actually, when push comes to shove, if they make a stand. It is positive. And Nightmaster, maybe, if I'm saying that. Until we, the people, start acting like our founding fathers, we will be a communist nation in 3 to 5 years. Man, if it's not close. I mean, it certainly is a centralized, I don't know, mercantilist, corporatist. Bob Murphy and Tom Woods would be better at what to name it. But it is very centralized. All the decisions going to Washington, D.C. And then when you have that happen, and I have it in my list to do a show on the McDonald case, because we heard for so many years that everything was going to be better as long as the Supreme Court declared that the Second Amendment meant an individual right to keep and bear arms, which is correct. But I haven't seen things getting improved. In fact, they keep getting worse. They keep getting worse. More background checks, the bump stock ban, which I did include in the links. I did an entire episode. Actually, I did 2 episodes on Trump's unconstitutional bump stock ban by executive fiat. Now, even if Congress passed it, it would be unconstitutional. But to me, it's even worse when it's done by the choice of one man or woman. It's really, really bad in that case. So get back to some of the things here that I wanted to cover. Now, going back, talking about the founders, and I've done full shows covering this. I want to mention this article from September of 2018 from Mike Meharry, who covered or basically explained some statements by John Adams. I'm not a huge John Adams fan in his later years when he became more of a central power supporting guy. But in comparison to today, even the worst ones, except maybe Hamilton, were great. Would be probably the best person in the U.S. government today in regards to federalism and the 10th Amendment and the Constitution. But in the early days, in the 1760s and 70s, for example, John Adams did a lot of awesome stuff. And in Mike's article called Obsta Principis, I never took Latin, so if I get it wrong, I got it from reading. Nip the shoots of arbitrary power in the bud. Again, all the links are in the show notes here on YouTube and, of course, over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/goodmorningliberty. And Mike starts out with, John Adams warned us, when you spot even the slightest violation of the Constitution, it's imperative that you nip it in the bud. Now, certainly it wasn't nipped in the bud in 1934 on gun control. It wasn't nipped in the bud in 1968. And then now we have the NRA bill instead of the Gun Violence Act, the Brady Act. The NRA, also maybe they've been on board with this kind of garbage all along. I don't know. And the NICS system. And then, of course, what they do becomes the next thing, which is Nancy Pelosi's version. So even let's say you're okay. You think it's okay to have background checks. What the hell do you think is going to happen if you have one level of background checks pushed by the gun rights organization? The commies, the lefties, the socialists, the anti-gun people, the people who hate individual liberty are going to take it to the next level. These government people never stop. They have to be resisted all the time. You can't give them a platform. You can't give them a baseline and say, okay, here you go, have some background checks. We're proud of passing these. Everyone should have them. What you guys passed, you Democrats passed, wasn't good enough. It was only on handguns. We need to have it on all guns. So the NRA actually expanded it and bragged about it as recently as a year ago. That is garbage. So John Adams, smarter guy than I, he was talking about some very minor tax that was going on. Very minor thing. A shilling duty on tea. Well, they took it off a shilling, imposing 3 pence. So basically a minor increase. And a lot of people were like, oh, okay, it's not all that bad. Like, can't we find another hill to fight on? And he wrote, Obsta Principis, a Latin phrase meaning withstanding beginnings or resist the first approaches of encroachments. Colloquially, we would say nip it in the bud, which is exactly the phraseology Adams used. He said, nip the shoots of arbitrary power in the bud is the only maxim which can ever preserve the liberties of any people. Period. Not me saying it. John Adams. And it was a known maxim. Nip the shoots of arbitrary power. If you don't do that, it'll always get worse. Always. And we have proof of that today. I'll never support the NRA as long as they do this. I will never support, like, when they do something right. Let's say, like, they've been pretty good on some state-level constitutional carry efforts. When they do that, great, okay. But this is huge. This is huge. I always look through to see all the gun control. I've been trying to put together a list of all the federal, at least, gun control passed. And I'm not finding any that don't have the NRA's hands on it. Maybe the Gun Control Act of 1968. I'm sure people can correct me on this. So this is how Mike reviewed that. He said, Adams recognized an important truth. When you allow government to chip away at the limits on its power, eventually the dam will burst. You will end up with a government exercising virtually unlimited authority, arbitrary power. At this point, he writes, it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to stop or rein it back in. And this is how John Adams put it. When the people give way, they're deceivers. I'll start that again. When the people give way, their deceivers, betrayers, and destroyers press upon them so fast that there is no resisting afterwards. So the interim Brady waiting period wasn't good enough. The NRA pushed for more, made it worse, expanded it. And then, of course, what's going to happen from there? The deceivers, the betrayers, and the destroyers of liberty will always push for more. And that's exactly what we see happening right now. Bump stock ban, expanding background checks, support for them from the people, the deceivers, the ones who tell us they're the gun rights people. Not good. And then the other one that I want to mention is from George Washington. I did an entire episode on George Washington's farewell address, The Unheeded Advice. We've got a video on it here on YouTube and over at 10thamendmentcenter.com. But George Washington warned that changing the rules and avoiding them, the same type of warning that John Adams had, is going to lead to very, very dangerous consequences. And this is part of what he said. But let there be no change by usurpation, for through this, in one instance, may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. The precedent must always greatly overbalance in permanent evil any partial or transient benefit which the use can at any time yield. So that would be my message taken from George Washington. Love him or hate him, much better guy than anyone who has been a president in modern times, by far. And like every president, he had his own faults and did some overreach and did some bad things. But in comparison, it's like, no, people who like immediately say, oh, you're quoting George Washington. Well, what about Whiskey Rebellion? Okay, yeah, let's say he sucked there. That doesn't mean everything else was bad. And then, like, compared to all the other things that they're doing today, like, that is almost nothing. Not to discount anything that they do that they shouldn't do. Like, for example, Jefferson didn't even believe that he should do the Louisiana Purchase, but there's a whole story behind that. So don't discount the things that they do bad, but look at it in comparison to what we have now. So George Washington is telling us, that's my warning to people who say, well, I'm with the NRA. We need background checks. I'm with Donald Trump. We need him a little stronger. Well, what's going to happen when you advocate that? The people who are your opponents, who want to shut down all guns, are going to take that as a new baseline and build upon it. They're not going to be like, oh, okay, suddenly I'm a Trump guy or I'm an NRA person, and that's as far as I'm going to go. No, you have to understand what they want to accomplish, which is a complete disarmament. They don't want people to have guns. They only want government to have guns. So you can't actually give them an inch. You can't give them a millimeter. You can't give them anything. And I just want to read that one more time before we close it out here. Even if you agree with the short-term benefits, they're going to use that new principle for something bad. This is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. The precedent must always greatly overbalance in permanent evil any partial or transient benefit. So every time you push something, every time Donald Trump says, I'm going to be strongly pushing comprehensive background checks, it's going to establish a precedent that there's going to be background checks, and therefore someone like Nancy Pelosi and her buddies are going to push even further than what Trump wanted. Maybe it isn't. For all I know, it's almost the same thing. I don't know what version of comprehensive background checks he wanted, but they're saying that this is comprehensive background checks. And I would say because of Trump's support and the NRA support, which I would never call a partisan organization, this is bipartisan background checks of 2019. Now, it's not going to get signed into law. We know that. But if we ignore the principle here, ignore what's happening, ignore the people who are pushing this type of thing, and ignore that one side, to me, they're not less bad. They're all bad on this. If we ignore that, or support one team because they may sound less worse, we're just going to keep getting worse and worse and worse over time. So I hope this irritated you as much as it irritated me, but I hope you at least found it interesting, educational, insightful, all that good stuff. It is important for me to get the information out to you. I'm just sharing my opinion. I don't believe in any gun control. I definitely don't believe in federal gun control. And it's incumbent upon us to make every effort possible to oppose in principle, in act, and in deed, within the realm of our ability, all of these. It is our duty. It's our duty to do this. So I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. This is an issue that really works me up, obviously. As Alan Mosley said earlier, things are getting spicy here. But I'm grateful for you spending some time with me. Another whole week here, the beginning of a new month here at Good Morning Liberty. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. We'll be back next week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, as we always are, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. Of course, smash the like, continue to leave some comments. Feel free to email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. I read them all, don't get back to everything. And again, have a great weekend. Thanks for spending some time with me today.